There were 14,000 US taxpayers who paid more income tax than Buffett in 2014. So the question then is, well, should we impose a wealth tax?
Welcome to another Breakout with Breaking Views, brought to you by PGIM. I'm Rob Cox, the editor of Breaking Views, and I'm speaking today with Edward Chancellor in the UK. You wrote a column this week looking at how governments are going to make up for all the costs associated with their battle against the COVID-19 pandemic. Your conclusion is basically that governments are going to need to impose new taxes, as they had done in the past when they fought wars. Elaborate a little bit on this, Eddie. What are we talking about? Who's paying the taxes?
Well, I mean, first of all, they kept on talking to us about the war on COVID, the war on coronavirus. Well, made me think that when Britain fought the Napoleonic Wars, we introduced the income tax for the first time. I thought, given that America's deficit was running at 15% of GDP last year, we should examine some potential new taxes. And the first one I look at is the question of a wealth tax. And that's really come into play recently when our friends at ProPublica, Jesse Eisinger and colleagues, published an expose showing that many of the richest Americans, George Soros, Jeff Bezos, Icahn, had not paid taxes in any federal income taxes in certain years. And that Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, there were 14,000 US taxpayers who paid more income tax than Buffett in 2014. So the question then is, well, should we impose a wealth tax? And the back of the envelope calculation is the top 25 Americans are worth around $2 trillion. And that a 2% wealth tax would raise far more, many multiples more of what they're paying in England.
Of course, a wealth tax isn't exactly, I mean, it exists. I just paid one in Switzerland. It exists in various countries, in rich countries. And it has been something that US Senators Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren both put forward last year as they were running for president.
Yeah, the case against a wealth tax is that it's meant to discourage enterprise. And also, when France introduced a wealth tax in the 1980s, it was said to drive thousands of French millionaires abroad. So, it's favored by socialists, let's say.
Right. Now, another one you pose here is the leverage tax, which is you tip your hat to our former colleague Martin Hutchinson. Explain this one.
So, I mean, as interest rates have fallen over the last 20 years, as you know, companies have geared up, leveraged themselves up. And I think the poster child for that was AT&T with its takeover of Time Warner. Its gross debt is around $350 billion. It's a fabulous sum. Now, a huge amount of debt in the financial system is risky, as we all know. So Hutchinson said, well, why not put a tax on leverage? Well, that seems to me to make pretty good sense, because AT&T would be paying, say, around $7 billion a year in extra leverage tax. A leverage tax at 2% would be $7 billion of extra tax. I think that would have stopped this ruinous AT&T deal. So I think there would be an advantage to leverage tax. I find that quite straightforward, particularly at the time when interest rates are very low.
Of course, many governments actually give you an ability to deduct the payment of debt payments against your income tax,
which is an absurd situation. So the leverage tax would get companies, instead of financial engineering, replacing equity with debt, would move the other way and start replacing debt with equity, and the world would be a safer place, and the taxman would get better revenues to boot. I think that's pretty much a no-brainer.
And a monopoly tax, explain that one.
The monopoly tax is actually my own idea. In correspondence with my friend Jonathan Tepper, who's written a book on the increasing concentration of US industry called The Myth of Capitalism. And the idea is that a capitalist economy requires a huge amount of competition, free competition. But what we've had again in recent decades is the super concentration of industries, partly the likes, big tech with its natural monopolies, and partly because of takeovers due to cheap funding. So the idea of a monopoly tax would be to extract the monopoly profits, or what we call rents, and take them away from Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg and put them in the public purse. So, so if you think of, if you put our taxes together, the likes of Zuckerberg would be hit with by A, the wealth tax, and B, the monopoly tax. I think a monopoly tax would be a pretty good idea, because the excess profits enjoyed by monopolies are actually rents and should properly be taken to, by the public.
You also had a green sales tax among your ideas.
Well, I mean, so one of the problems of capitalism, and I think people are becoming increasingly aware of that, is that the externalities, pollution and so forth, are actually often borne by the public and not by the person who produces them. Now, the original idea proposed by this British economist, Ronald Coase, is that the government should tax these externalities on the companies. I'm suggesting that actually we could have the equivalent of environmental sin taxes, and the sin tax would work in a way that, just as it does on tobacco or alcohol, that, say, for instance, a diesel car would pay a higher rate of sales tax than an electric vehicle. That to some extent already exists, because electric vehicles are subsidized, and that actually is a sort of negative sales.
But isn't that, so how would that differ from a carbon tax? And I guess one other point to that is, isn't that regressive? Wouldn't it be the diesel? I mean, I think of the Gilets jaunes who came out against Emmanuel Macron's, similar attempt.
Well, I mean, all sales taxes are regressive. I mean, I suppose you could have an extra tax on luxury super yachts.
Jet fuel, I suppose.
Maseratis, Rob. So, I mean, yes, all sales taxes are regressive, but this would be the state trying to direct expenditure towards ends that were less environmentally destructive. I think it's a nice idea, but the trouble is that it would be administratively extraordinarily complex.
But at the end of the day, Eddie, governments, these are all difficult things to get past. So the political realities mean maybe, if you're lucky, some elements of this come out in the next couple of years in legislation, but more likely not.
I don't think any of these ideas are really going to fly. And I'll tell you why. Is that first of all, you have unintended consequences. The British introduced a window tax for the war on France in the late 17th century, and people blocked up their windows. So you had these unintended consequences. The second thing is, as people in Britain remember, is that when Mrs. Thatcher introduced a poll tax, there were massive riots, and her long reign came to an end. So I think the politicians can be far too cautious about introducing any of these new taxes. Instead, what they will do, I am pretty sure, is they will revert to the oldest tax to finance war in history, a tax that doesn't require legislation, a tax that doesn't require the assent of the people, namely an inflation tax. And there we already have it, because the central banks are printing money. And the nice thing about an inflation tax, that the super rich, including Warren Buffett, will have extraordinary difficulties trying to evade it.
All right, well, thanks for that, Eddie. We'll be back with another breakout from Breaking Views soon.
Thanks.